I've spent most of my adult life working the night shift as a security guard. It's not the kind of job that'll make you rich, but it pays the bills. Gas stations, convenience stores, and small warehouses. Those were my usual assignments. They were lonely but predictable, uneventful, most nights. When I saw the ad for a security position at Oakwood Mall, it seemed like a rare opportunity. The hours weren't bad, 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. The pay? Better than anything I'd seen in years. And the mall? It was a familiar place, a hub of activity during the day. The thought of keeping watch over an empty mall at night seemed almost peaceful. The ad said they needed someone immediately, which should have been my first red flag. But I didn't think twice. I submitted my application and, to my surprise, got a call the very next day. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Mr. Carson, the mall manager. "Can you come in this afternoon?" he asked. It was abrupt, but I needed the job. "Of course. What time?" 2 o'clock, he replied. His voice was friendly, but there was an urgency to it, like he couldn't afford to waste time. That afternoon, I drove to Oakwood Mall, feeling equal parts excitement and curiosity. The mall was buzzing with shoppers, parents wrangling kids, and teenagers loitering outside stores like Foot Locker and Spencer's. It was hard to imagine this place empty, silent. Mr. Carson's office was tucked away in a corner of the administrative wing, far from the hustle of the food court and retail stores. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with a receding hairline and the tired look of someone juggling too many responsibilities. "Thanks for coming in on such short notice," he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm but hurried, like he had a million other things to do. The interview was quick, almost rushed. "Have you worked security before?" he asked. I told him about my experience, the late nights spent watching gas station cameras and patrolling quiet lots. He nodded along, but I got the sense he wasn't really listening. His eyes kept darting to the clock on the wall. "Here's the deal," he said, leaning forward. "Your job's simple. Check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, do an hourly patrol, and lock up securely when your shift ends. The usual stuff." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "There's one thing," he added, hesitating. "Keep an eye on the escalators in the children's play area. Things can get weird sometimes." "Weird how?" I asked, smiling nervously, thinking he was joking. "Teenagers sneaking in, playing pranks," he said quickly, brushing off my question. "You know how kids are." I wasn't sure I believed him, but I didn't press. "Can you start tonight?" he asked abruptly. The question caught me off guard. Most places needed at least a day or two to process paperwork, maybe even run a background check. But Mr. Carson seemed desperate. "Sure," I said. Relief washed over his face. "Great. Here's your key to the security office. Show up at 11 p.m. sharp. I'll meet you at the employee entrance." He shook my hand again, this time with more force. "Good luck." I left the office with mixed feelings. Part of me was excited to start right away. Another part couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. What did he mean by weird? Why did he seem so relieved to have me take the job? I tried to brush it off as nerves. After all, I've been looking for steady work for months. This was a step up. I drove home, ate a quick dinner, and tried to get some rest before my shift. At 10:45 p.m., I pulled into the Oakwood Mall parking lot. The difference was striking. During the day, the lot was packed, cars vying for spaces near the entrances. Now, it was nearly empty, save for a few scattered vehicles parked under the dim glow of streetlights. The building itself loomed in the dark, its massive silhouette outlined against the night sky. As I walked to the employee entrance, the silence pressed in. The wind rustled a discarded wrapper near my feet, the only sound breaking the stillness. It felt unnatural, like the mall was holding its breath. Mr. Carson was waiting for me at the door. He seemed even more hurried than he had during the interview. "Follow me," he said, leading me through a series of back hallways to the security office. The office was a small, windowless room at the heart of the mall. Monitors lined one wall, displaying grainy black and white feeds from security cameras positioned throughout the building. A desk with a single chair took up most of the space, leaving just enough room to pace if you needed to. "Everything you need is here," Mr. Carson said, gesturing to the monitors. "Remember, check the cameras regularly, do your rounds, and keep an eye on those escalators and the play area. He hesitated again, his tone softening. It's important that you follow the rules. The way he said it made my skin crawl. What kind of rules? I asked. Just common sense stuff, he said, avoiding the question. You'll be fine. See you in the morning. He left without another word, leaving me alone in the office. The silence settled over me like a heavy blanket. I took a seat at the desk, my eyes scanning the monitors. Most of the feeds showed empty hallways, their tile floors gleaming under dim fluorescent lights. A few cameras focused on the food court, its tables and chairs neatly arranged, and the children's play area, with its colorful jungle gym and plastic slides. At first, it was peaceful, almost relaxing. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. This wasn't so bad, but as the minutes ticked by, the unease crept back in. The silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the monitors, set my nerves on edge. I tried to distract myself by flipping through the camera feeds. One monitor showed the entrance to a high-end clothing store, another a corridor lined with closed jewelry shops. All quiet. Then I noticed something. A faint movement on one of the screens. My eyes snapped back to it, scanning for what had caught my attention. It was nothing, just a trick of the light, maybe. I shook my head, laughing nervously. Get a grip, I muttered. Just as I was starting to relax again, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat. There stood an older man in a janitor's uniform, holding a mop and bucket. He was grinning, clearly amused by my reaction. Didn't mean to scare ya, he said. You must be the new guy. I let out a nervous laugh. Yeah, that's me. Didn't realize there was a janitor here at night. They keep one of us around, he said, his grin fading. To clean up. Make sure everything's ready for the morning. His tone changed, growing more serious. Listen, kid. Follow the rules, and you'll be fine. Rules? I asked, confused. He reached into his pocket and handed me a crumpled piece of paper. These rules, he said. I unfolded the paper and scanned it quickly. The rules were bizarre. Check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, but don't stare too long. Never look directly at the mannequins after midnight. If they move, leave immediately. You serious? I asked, half laughing. His expression didn't change. Dead serious. The last guy didn't listen. What happened to him? I asked. The janitor's eyes darkened. Quit after one night. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the list and a sinking feeling in my stomach. By the time Mr. Hensley left me alone in the security office, the weight of silence pressed in. The mall was massive, its size exaggerated by the emptiness. The security office was cramped, barely bigger than a supply closet, and lined with outdated monitors displaying black and white feeds from the mall's numerous cameras. I flipped through them out of habit, adjusting to the flickering screens. Stores sat in ghostly stillness, mannequins stared blankly out of darkened windows, and the food court looked like a scene abandoned mid-rush. I could do this, I told myself. Just follow the protocols. Check cameras. Patrol hourly. Easy. At least, that's what I thought. Until the janitor showed up. It started with the faint sound of a mop swishing across tiles. I hadn't seen anyone on the cameras, but the sound grew louder until a figure appeared in the doorway. The janitor was an older man with a wiry frame. His uniform faded and his face lined with age and wear. His name tag read, Harold. Didn't mean to spook you, he said, his voice gravelly but kind. I exhaled, realizing I'd tensed up. You didn't. I mean, maybe a little. I didn't know there was a janitor here at night. Harold gave a short chuckle, leaning on his mop. Yeah, one of us sticks around. Never know what you might run into in a place like this. The way he said it set my nerves on edge. I forced a laugh, just trying to get through my first shift. He nodded, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. Here, he said, holding it out to me. Might want to read this. I frowned but took the paper. What's this? The real rules, Harold replied, his expression darkening. You follow those, you might make it through the night. It sounded ridiculous, but something in his tone told me he wasn't joking. I unfolded the paper, scanning the list. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in haste, but the words were clear. Check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, but never stare at the footage for too long. Do not look directly at the mannequins after midnight. If they move, leave the area immediately. If you hear a child laughing near the play area, leave right away. Avoid looking into the restroom mirrors after midnight. If the escalators start running, don't investigate. Watch from the cameras only. If you hear someone crying in a dressing room, do not open the door. Never leave the building before your shift ends. If you do, you risk being followed outside. My stomach nodded as I read the rules. This had to be a prank. I looked up, ready to confront Harold, but his expression stopped me. There was no humor in his eyes, only warning. Seriously? I asked, holding up the paper. What is this? A joke? Harold shook his head, his gaze unwavering. I'm serious as a heart attack, kid. Last guy didn't listen. One shift was all it took. I scoffed, trying to shake off the growing unease. What happened to him? He quit, Harold said simply, but he wasn't the same when he walked out of here. The words hung heavy in the air. I wanted to press him for more, but something told me I wouldn't like the answers. Thanks for the advice, I guess. Harold leaned in closer, lowering his voice. You've got till morning to figure out what's what. Just don't ignore the rules. With that, he left, disappearing into the maze of darkened hallways with his mop and bucket. His words lingered long after he was gone. It was nearing midnight when I started my first patrol. The mall, vibrant and bustling by day, now felt like a hollow shell. Shadows stretched long and twisted across the floor, and every sound seemed unnaturally loud. The buzz of a flickering light, the soft creak of settling walls, my own footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. I walked past rows of darkened storefronts, my flashlight illuminating displays frozen in time. Designer handbags, mannequins dressed in the latest trends, shelves of books that would never be browsed at this hour. Everything looked normal until I reached the play area. The play zone was a small section of the mall near the food court, filled with colorful plastic slides and climbing structures. By day, it was loud and chaotic, filled with laughter and the squeals of children. Now, it was unnervingly silent. My flashlight swept across the area, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker of something out of place. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I forced myself to keep walking, chalking it up to nerves. But the unease stayed with me as I moved on, making my way toward the escalators. It wasn't until I passed one of the clothing stores that the first rule truly hit me. The store's glass doors were partially open, just wide enough to make me pause. I shone my flashlight inside, scanning the darkened interior. Rows of mannequins stood on display, their featureless faces illuminated in the beam of light. Nothing moved, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stepped closer, peering through the glass. One of the mannequins near the back looked wrong. Its position was slightly off, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. My heart rate quickened as I stared at it, the rule echoing in my mind. Do not look directly at the mannequins after midnight. I took a step back, telling myself it was my imagination. But then I heard it, a faint rustling, like fabric shifting in the dark. My flashlight flicked back to the mannequins, and my breath hitched. The one near the back had moved. It was closer now, just enough to make my stomach churn. Nope, I muttered, backing away. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned and walked briskly back toward the main hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it was following me. The rest of the patrol passed uneventfully until I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. But as I approached the escalators, the sound grew louder. The rhythmic hum of machinery, the unmistakable whir of steps moving in endless rotation. The escalators were running. My heart sank as the rule resurfaced in my mind. If the escalators start running, don't investigate. Watch from the cameras only. I stopped in my tracks, gripping my flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached. The logical part of me wanted to see it for myself, to confirm what I was hearing. But the weight of Harold's warning kept my feet rooted in place. Instead, I turned and made my way back to the security office as quickly as I could. My nerves stretched to their breaking point. The sound of the escalators faded with each step, but the dread stayed with me. By the time I reached the office, my hands were shaking. I locked the door behind me and sank into the chair, flipping through the camera feeds until I found the escalators. The image on the monitor made my blood run cold. A figure stood on the escalator, a tall, spindly shape, its limbs too long and its head cocked unnaturally to the side. It moved jerkily, almost as if it were a marionette on invisible strings. And then, as I stared at the screen, the figure turned its head toward the camera. Toward me. The screen flickered, the static crackling loudly, and the figure disappeared. I sat back, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever was in this mall wasn't done with me yet. I glanced at the list of rules, the words now etched into my mind. Surviving the night wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. I couldn't stay in the office much longer. The weight of silence in that tiny room felt suffocating, and the image of the spindly figure on the escalator burned in my mind. I had to move, had to do something to take my mind off the growing sense of dread. Glancing at the clock, I saw that it was nearing 1 a.m. I had hours to go. With a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped back into the empty halls of the mall. The play area came into view again as I turned a corner. Its colorful plastic slides and tunnels stood in eerie contrast to the dim lighting that flickered overhead. This time, I avoided shining my flashlight directly at it. But as I walked past, the faintest sound reached my ears, a child's laugh. It was soft at first, like an echo drifting through the air. I froze in place, my grip tightening on the flashlight. Rule 3. If you hear a child laughing near the play area, leave immediately. I didn't move at first, unsure if I was imagining things. The laugh came again, louder this time, high-pitched and full of playful mischief. It sent a chill crawling up my spine. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. Hello? The word slipped out before I could stop it, echoing into the void. The laughter stopped abruptly, as if cut off by a knife. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd felt all night. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I turned and walked away as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint. My next stop was a clothing store on the other side of the mall. Unlike the play area, this store's doors were shut, but the window displays gave me a clear view of the mannequins posed inside. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the floor, determined not to repeat my earlier mistake. As I passed the store, I heard it, a faint, muffled sobbing coming from deeper inside. It sounded like a woman crying, the sound heavy with despair. Rule 6. If you hear someone crying in a dressing room, do not open the door. I stopped dead in my tracks. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, and I felt an inexplicable pull toward the store. What if someone was actually in there? What if someone needed help? Hello? I called, my voice trembling. Is someone there? The crying stopped instantly. A knot formed in my stomach as I took a step back. My flashlight flickered, the bulb sputtering for a moment before stabilizing. The silence was deafening, and I forced myself to keep walking. Whatever was in there, it wasn't something I wanted to meet. I checked my watch as I walked back toward the main hallway. It read 12:45 a.m., but that couldn't be right. I had started this patrol well past 1 a.m. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Rule 7. If you check the time and it's earlier than the last time you looked, immediately return to the security office. I turned on my heel and broke into a jog, my flashlight beam bouncing erratically with every step. The mall seemed darker now, the shadows deeper and more menacing. The once familiar layout felt like it was shifting under my feet, stretching and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. I reached the office, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I collapsed into the chair, staring at the monitors. The escalator feed caught my eye again. It was still, unmoving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I flipped through the other feeds, desperate to see something normal, anything that would ground me in reality. At 4 a.m., I was startled by a knock on the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I glanced at the monitor, showing the hallway outside the office. It was empty. Rule 8. Lock the security office door between 4 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. and do not open it for anyone. The knock came again, louder this time. "Hey, it's Harold," a familiar voice called out. "You doing okay in there?" I froze, my mind racing. Harold, the janitor who'd given me the rules. But he'd disappeared hours ago, and Mr. Hensley had said there wasn't a night janitor. The knocking grew more insistent. "Come on, open up. I just want to check in. Don't worry, you're almost through." I checked the monitor again. Still nothing. My hand hovered over the door handle, every instinct telling me not to open it. "Let me in, kid," the voice said, this time deeper, more guttural. "I can help you." The sound sent a wave of nausea rolling through me. I gripped the list of rules in my hand like a lifeline, reminding myself that this was just one more test. The knocking stopped, and silence returned. I stayed glued to the chair, unable to move or even breathe properly until the clock finally struck 4:30. At 5 a.m., I heard it again, the unmistakable hum of the escalators. My stomach twisted into knots as I flipped to the camera feed. The escalators were moving, their mechanical rhythm filling the air with a ghostly sound. On the screen, a figure stepped onto the escalator. It was tall and impossibly thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its head twisted at an angle that shouldn't have been possible, and its long arms dangled limply at its sides. As I watched, the figure slowly turned its head toward the camera. Its blank face seemed to stare directly at me, though it had no eyes. The screen flickered, static briefly taking over, and when the image returned, the figure was gone. I stayed in the office, too afraid to leave again. The rules had saved me so far, and I wasn't about to break any of them now. My watch ticked closer to 6 a.m., and I felt a glimmer of hope. But the mall wasn't done with me yet. The monitors flickered, and a new figure appeared. It was the crying woman, her long dark hair obscuring her face. She floated down the hallway, heading straight for the security office. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her approach. She stopped outside the door, her movements eerily still. Then, she knocked. The knock at the door was soft at first, almost polite, but each successive rap grew louder, more insistent. My entire body froze as I stared at the monitor. The figure outside the door, the crying woman, stood motionless, her head tilted slightly downward, hair cascading like a curtain to hide her face. I tightened my grip on the crumpled rules in my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Do not open the door," I repeated to myself like a prayer. Her voice broke the silence. A hoarse, desperate whisper seeped through the heavy door. "Please let me in. I'm lost." I clenched my fists, trying to block out the sound, but her voice persisted, cracking with anguish. "Help me. It's so cold." I forced myself to look at the monitor again. She hadn't moved, but the crying was louder now, raw and haunting. My entire body screamed at me to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving behind a suffocating silence. I stared at the monitor for what felt like an eternity, waiting for her to leave. When she finally drifted out of view, the air in the office seemed to ease just slightly, but my reprieve was short-lived. The janitor appeared on the screen, walking casually down the hallway toward the security office. I blinked in disbelief. He looked exactly as he had earlier in the night, calm, unbothered, like nothing unusual was happening. He knocked on the door. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice light, almost cheerful. "You're doing good. Almost there." I didn't respond. I just stared at the monitor, my eyes locked on his figure. Something about him felt off, even more so than before. "You don't need to be scared," he said, his voice muffled through the door. "Open up. I'll explain everything." I glanced at the clock. 5:45 a.m. The rules had been clear. Under no circumstances should I open the door before my shift ended. "Come on," the janitor said, knocking again. "You've been following the rules, right? You're safe with me." The screen flickered, and for a split second, his face distorted. His grin stretched unnaturally wide, his eyes dark and hollow. When the feed stabilized, he was back to normal, smiling like nothing had happened. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. The janitor's knocking grew louder, more forceful, until it sounded like someone was trying to break the door down. The walls of the office seemed to shake with every pound of his fist. "Let me in." His voice boomed, deep and guttural, no longer human. The monitor flickered again, and the camera feed outside the door went to static. My heart sank. I was completely blind to whatever was happening out there. I crouched behind the desk, clutching the list like it was a lifeline. The pounding on the door was relentless, each blow vibrating through the small room. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. The clock read 5:59 a.m. I crawled out from behind the desk, my knees weak and shaking. I checked the monitors again, but the feeds were all static now. I couldn't see anything. Then, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Hey, it's Mr. Hensley. Your shift's over. Open up." I froze. The clock read 6:01 a.m. The shift was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was another trick. I hesitated, staring at the door, unsure of what to do. "Come on," Hensley's voice said again, calm and reassuring. "You made it. Time to go home." I checked the monitor again, hoping the static had cleared. It hadn't. My hand hovered over the door handle. If it was Hensley, I couldn't keep him waiting forever. But if it wasn't, taking a deep breath, I cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. Mr. Hensley stood there, looking tired but otherwise normal. Relief washed over me as I opened the door fully. "Rough night?" he asked, giving me a small smile. I nodded, unable to find the words to explain what I'd experienced. "You're not the first guard to look like that after their first shift," he said, his tone almost amused. "Come on, let's get you out of here." As we walked through the mall, the atmosphere felt normal. The lights were steady, the halls quiet in a way that didn't feel oppressive. It was like the horrors of the night had been erased with the dawn. When we reached the exit, I turned to Hensley. What is this place?" His smile faded, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's just a mall," he said, but his tone carried an edge of something deeper. "Some places have quirks. Things you don't question if you want to keep working here. Why didn't you warn me?" I demanded. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Would you have taken the job if I had?" I couldn't answer. He handed me a small envelope containing my pay for the night and clapped me on the shoulder. "Think about it," he said before walking back into the mall, the doors shutting behind him. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the envelope in my hands. The events of the night replayed in my mind, each moment more surreal than the last. When I finally drove away, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't coming back. Some places aren't meant to be understood, and this mall was one of them. As I pulled into my driveway, I glanced at the crumpled list of rules still clutched in my hand. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It was proof that what I'd experienced wasn't just a nightmare. It was real, and somewhere, in the dark corners of that mall, it still is.